those respectable foundations come, in the era of mercantilism. So the first real issue is to discuss and describe what it was, when it was, and so on and so forth. And so I'll give you an inkling now, but we'll get into it in more detail. Mercantilism is not so much a school of thought as a set of general principles. If someone says, what is a mercantilist? It's a bit like saying, sort of, what is an elephant? You know, you can recognize it when you see it. It's very difficult to define. Mercantilists tend to be known by what they do rather than by what they think. And typically, they're a bunch of protectionists. They are in favor of building up stocks of gold and silver. They're in favor of infant industries. A whole bunch of things that get lumped together. And people say, well, yes, there's mercantilist thinking for you. But actually, there are very few people who've ever encompassed all of these possibilities. So we tend to see it. We tend to see mercantilism in a range of sort of features. The one that, in fact, in tomorrow's sessions when we're talking about Adam Smith and David Hume, we'll talk about a lot, is naive bullionism. The bullionists were people who said, look, what matters is money. We have to run a consistent trade surplus. If we are exporting more than we're importing, that's good. Why is it good? Well, because then we're accumulating gold and silver, what they used to call specie. And most people, if you go to the man in the street today and say, what is better, to be running a trade surplus or running a trade deficit? He'll say, surplus. Surplus sounds good. The other, the common view, okay? Man in the street. Protection. Does this sound like Donald Trump? Yes. Protection. Does it sound like Julius Malema talking about our chickens? Yes. Classic mercantilists. Okay? We've got to have protection in order to try to help us run trade surplus, because trade surpluses are good. But there's also a variant on this. Okay, what most people these days know is the infant industry argument, that an economy has to evolve, that most economies start off as agricultural, maybe a bit of mining, primary products. But what you want to do is to have that economy evolve into a manufacturing sector and then ultimately a service sector and so on and so forth. But in order to get that evolution into manufacturing, you may need an element of protection. Okay, to start off from scratch and beat the big guys overseas can be very, very difficult. There's also an historicist view, and this we tend to associate with Jean-Baptiste Colbert in France, but in fact it comes up under Bismarck in Germany. The idea that you want to centralize authority, you want to increase state power, and in order to do that, in order to have a strong state, you have a need for protection and you have a need for a trade surplus. And this type of thinking actually goes back far further than the examples I gave. Henry VII, my wife's sort of pet sidewinder of the Tudor era, was really strong on the idea of centralizing authority. With the breakup of this sort of fragmented Middle Ages states, these tiny little kind of city authorities, dukedoms, principalities, and the formation of nation states, the idea of a strong central government became really powerful. And in order to have a strong central government, you have to be able to pay an army. Armies don't work for nothing. So let's try and work all these through a bit. Okay, when? Now, I've said mercantilist thinking is still with us. But when economic historians talk about the era of mercantilism, they're typically talking about a period between the late Middle Ages and the age of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire comes in as a term round about here, about 20 years before 30 years before the French Revolution, when you have a group of economists in France, the physiocrats, headed by a physician, actually, Quesnay, who were pushing the idea that one needs to have free markets. Free up the market and everything will be well. It said that Quesnay was asked by Colbert, what can I do to make the economy work? And he was told, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Just get out of it. The least government is the best government. If we look at this period, okay, we have some really kind of well-known characters. So here we have Henry VII in England. Okay, the formation of the Tudor state, which is the end of the Wars of the Roses. All this sort of divisive business has been going on for 100 years or so. And he says, right, we have to have unity. No more sort of feuding lords. A central state with a fiscus, with a budget, and an army. Machiavelli in Italy saying much the same thing. You need to have strong authority. Baudin, same idea. The theory of the nation state coming from him in France. And in Central Europe, you had these monumental wars of religion, which were absolutely appalling. They were a bloodbath. They get resolved in the Peace of Westphalia. And again, you have unification of states. So the idea of strong central authority is really starting to emerge. And then in 1665, as I've put it, Colbert, France was a basket case. It was corrupt. It was corrupt in so many ways. It was inefficient, and the tax farms were the sort of quintessence of what was wrong with France. It was said that 50% of the money raised in taxes reached the king. The other 50% made the tax farmers rich. It ended up as one of the causes of the French Revolution, but Colbert was dedicated to getting rid of it. And his idea was, in order to formulate a strong state, you need to have a strong fiscal system, you need to have efficiency, and you need to have, above all, industry. Now, one of the characteristics of this era is a belief that manufactured products are somehow or other good. They're easier to tax, so on and so forth. And agriculture was pushed down in the scale of things. One of Quesnay's great sort of pressures was to restore agriculture to the status that it had under the ancient Greeks and Romans, when agriculture was a high status activity. Okay. So what's the aim? Now, the great writer on mercantilism, Eli Heckscher, said that the subject and object of mercantilist economic endeavors is a strong state. That is what it's about. If you look at all those historic figures that I put up there, at the center of all of them, this absolute horror of the fragmented Europe that had seen these bloodbaths that ran literally for centuries. So the aim is to assist in state unification, yes, but you want an economic policy that's going to do a few things. One of them, you don't want to have markets collapsing because of oversupply. It's one of the little aspects that sort of pops up every now and then. But this isn't something that we really associate with China. It's certainly not something that we think of ourselves associating with Donald Trump. So is there an equivalent? Well, if you think about where you make money in a modern economy, it's not in the competitive sectors by and large. It's in the old-fashioned oligopolies. When the sage of Omaha stands up and says, where should you put your money? It's in old industry stocks which are focused on natural oligopolies and monopolies. That's where the money is. That's where the growth is, surprisingly. And if you think about what a monopoly does, it is protecting, it's guarding against the oversupply of goods. It's keeping prices up artificially by restricting supply. And we'll discover that big aspects of mercantilism involve the protection of monopolies. But the thing that we normally think about is that third one. There's a monetary component, okay, balance of trade theory. But Heckscher makes a very strong point. He says, when the genuine mercantilist advocates protection, he's not just being a naive bullionist. He's not just saying we have to run a trade surplus. There is often very much more to it. And I'll try and go through the details of some of the classic mercantilists, in particular Thomas Mann, in an attempt to sort of show all of this. Okay. Nonetheless, you do have, through all of mercantilism, this belief that specie, gold and silver, old-fashioned bullion, matters. It is important. So why? I mean, these people were not stupid. So what they're credited with, and this is the fault of Adam Smith, okay? If you look at Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, and we'll do it tomorrow, he keeps on saying, these are people who believe that money equals wealth. And Plato and Aristotle had been arguing against this for years. I mean, the notion that money means anything, the myth of Croesus, it was Minos, who sort of starved to death because he wanted everything he touched to turn into gold. Midas. It's not something new. Okay, gold and silver are not wealth. They're only what they can buy. More important was the second one. Okay, pecunia novus belli. The idea that money is the sinews of war. Okay, the origin, I checked it out actually, it comes from Cicero, it comes from the Philippics. And Cicero is actually a little, he says, nervi belli pecunia infinita. You actually don't just need a little bit of money. You need serious amounts of money if you're going to run a war. Because in an era of professional soldiers, and the Middle Ages really were seriously into professional soldiery, if you ain't got money, you're not going to survive. Now, and they didn't work for paper. They wanted the real stuff. So you needed a war chest, in the classic sense. But there's real economics at the bottom of it as well. If you think about the business of running an economy, you have to levy taxes. If you're going to levy taxes by running around taking people's sheep, taking people's goats, lifting the honey from their hives, it's very, very messy. It's very, very inefficient. In a monetized world, tax is so much easier. You tell people how much cash they have to pay. Dead simple. Everyone knows where they stand. Now, the old sort of formal levies Okay, levies in terms of you will pay tax by working in the corvée for so many weeks a year, have stayed with us for a long time, but they are extremely unpopular. Witness the fate of Louis XVI. They tried this in Zimbabwe in the 1950s, caused major problems. Requiring people to pay taxes in the form of labor on the roads can really get you into serious trouble. Money is much simpler. There's also a view, heavily contested, that you'll find in one of the appendices at the very end of Keynes's general theory. Keynes says, like everybody else in economics, I was brought up to the view that free trade is good and protection is bad. And then he said, I think I saw the error of my ways. Because he said, in this time, in the era of the mercantilists, how did you stimulate an economy? There was no central bank that was going to go for quantitative easing. There was no banking system that was going to lower interest rates. What you could do was try to increase the supply of coinage. And if you increase the supply of coinage, A, money is a lubricant in an economy, but B, it means that the price of money when you want to borrow is going to go down. The real interest rate is going to decline. So to stimulate an economy, to get things moving, you need to up the amount of cash in circulation. And the way to do that is by running a consistent trade surplus. Heckscher disagreed with him profoundly. Okay, so how does it work? Well, the first is we have a series of mechanisms and consequences. It's based on interventionist economic policies. All mercantilism, in some way, requires you to be an interventionist. If you want the economy to run a consistent trade surplus, you've got to have protection, you've got to have stimulatory policies, you have to have all sorts of incentives. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Implicitly, what we're talking about is a zero-sum view of the world. Implicitly, we're saying, if I win, you must lose. We cannot have all parties benefiting at once, and this is where Adam Smith and David Ricardo pounced on them. For Smith and Ricardo, the great thing about exchange of any sort, why do I go into business selling something to you and buying something from you? Because we both believe that we're benefiting. The whole business of trade, the business of commerce, works because all participants benefit. And Smith said, well, if that's true for individuals living in a town, why should it not be true for countries that are trading with one another? International trade is no different to domestic trade. If people are going to trade, they're going to trade voluntarily. You're not going to hold a gun to someone's head and say, you will sell to me at a discounted price or else. Outside of Colombia, perhaps. The idea of the zero-sum view of the world, which is implicit in mercantilism, is perhaps its greatest weakness. But we'll see in the third of these lectures that that zero-sum view of the world is not always as critical to mercantilist thinking as Adam Smith was suggesting. That in fact you can believe in gains from trade and be a protectionist at the same time. Okay, and this is not talking about the American view of free trade, which is we can export to anyone we want, provided they don't export to us. Another is increased militarism. This is, again, something that even the ancient Greeks had talked about. If you look at Plato's Republic, if you want all the good stuff, you're going to end up having to have an army. Okay, in a world of heavily protected trade and spheres of influence, you end up having heavily militarized systems. In order to protect your markets, your foreign markets against other people, you need to have a navy. You need to have an army. If you look at the wars between the Dutch and the English in the 1700s, between the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English and the French in earlier centuries, what were they about? Ultimately, they were about
getting land and use that resources to make their wealth bigger and paying the people.
Ultimately, if you wanted to protect your market, you had to be willing to put boots on the ground, and that's expensive, and that needs gold and silver again. Repression of labor is kind of interesting. How do you export more? You export more by selling cheaper. How do you sell cheaper? You cut the costs of production. How do you cut the costs of production? Have your workforce breeding rapidly and force the prices of labor down. And all through the mercantilist pattern of thought, you see this system coming up over and over again, that we need to keep labor costs down in order to be competitive. We've talked about it before, the distortion of the economy against agriculture. Okay, unless you are an agricultural exporter. So when Britain was exporting wool, they were all in favor of it. But then the British got smart and said, why should we export the wool to Flanders? Why don't we import Flemish weavers and have them do the good stuff here? And granted, occasionally they sort of staged odd demonstrations, did in their Flemish weavers because they were from overseas. There's nothing new in Britain. But they conceived that if you really want to add wealth, if you want to add value, you take your raw materials and you process them domestically rather than exporting the raw material for someone else to add the value overseas. The idea that one can import unprocessed goods and process them locally is not something that is just a characteristic of China. That's what they do to us. China is importing iron ore, importing coal from South Africa so that they can run blast furnaces and pollute their own atmosphere. In China, rationally it makes no sense. The cost of transporting billets of pig iron or rolled steel from South Africa to China would be far less than the cost of sending these endless ore vessels from Saldanha Bay. But they want to add the value locally. Again, classic mercantilism. The rise of trading monopolies and colonialism is interesting. When I first went to Canada, I was intrigued to see that the local department store was called The Bay. The Bay is the last relic of the Company of Gentlemen Adventurers of Hudson's Bay, founded under royal charter by Charles II. It was one of an infinite number of trading monopolies that existed in that era. The one that South Africa is most familiar with, of course, is the Dutch East India Company. Okay, the trading monopoly, the Muscovy Company to trade in Russia, the Dutch East India Company to trade in the Dutch East Indies, the British East India Company to trade in India and the East Indies. They were all over the place. But the idea was you are given the right, the exclusive right, to trade in a particular area. Okay? It made a certain amount of sense. It made sense insofar as trading was a risky business. If you wanted to send a ship out, it was going to take 3 or 4 years to get back from the East Indies, and there was a fair chance that it wouldn't get back at all. So what you needed to do is to send out numerous ships, spread your risk, classic insurance policy, spread the risks on a high return. If you just send the one, the expected return may be high, but the risk is also high. Send out a fleet, and you're okay. But to do that, you have to be able to aggregate your money. You need a system of bookkeeping. You need a system of guarantees and royal charters. It worked. But it's the roots of colonialism. If you think about the British Empire, where did it rise? Over here. Spain, Portugal, Holland, all of them trying to protect their trading interests. Ultimately, what do? You take over the land and colonize. The other thing is the major beneficiaries of this whole process. Merchant capital. Now, in earlier years, wealth had accrued to people who either had a fast horse and a heavy sword, or who controlled land. You either controlled land or you controlled labor. Now, for the first time, we see the rise of the merchant. And the merchant now has status. That is the real change. In the time of Plato and Aristotle, merchants made money, but they had absolutely no status in society. They were regarded as the scum of the earth. The only thing worse than trading in goods was trading in money. Now suddenly, the banker and the merchant are respectable. Okay, so general approaches. How do you actually do all of this? Well, typically, parts of this are trade related. Encourage exports, discourage imports, cultivate foreign markets and colonies, all the stuff that you would absolutely expect. Some of it is efficiency related, and this is where people like Colbert pop up. In the Middle Ages, if you wanted to move goods from A to B, it was immensely problematic and very, very expensive, because every couple of miles someone set up a toll booth. Tolls and taxes and sort of robber barons and who knows what else were a pain in the neck. To move goods from A to B was extremely difficult. And Colbert's first real insight was to get France wealthy, he had to cut the tolls so that goods could go from the south of France to the north of France along well-established canals. They would be safe, they would be easy, and there would be no tolls. And the internal commerce of the nation could take off. And he was responsible for building most of the big canals in France. In what was earlier the Holy Roman Empire, again, tolls had been an absolute menace. And they battled to get rid of them. And if you think of what it was that led to the unification of Germany, those of you who sort of did the unification of Germany when you were at school in history will remember the word Zollverein. Okay? The customs union. It was the customs union that allowed the unification of the state. Some of it is stability related. Okay? You need to broaden the country's economic base. You need to protect infant industries. This is particularly true of the American brand of protectionist mercantilism. And some of it is security related. I love the Navigation Acts in England with this very, very sort of serious term that they use: we have to support English bottoms. In other words, the Navy needs your support. If the Navy is strong, if the Navy is healthy, then all will be well. So they introduced legislation, basically to the effect that if you want to import or export goods from English ports, it has to happen in English vessels. The British Merchant Navy was a classic piece of protectionism. Today we have Panamanian registered vessels, not a big deal. In those days, it was really important that the Royal Navy had a supply of qualified seamen that it could draw on, and that there were vessels that could be turned to multiple purposes. And merchant vessels could become defensive or attacking vessels very easily. So, all sorts of rules and regulations, great stuff. And then we look at the people involved. So, we've talked about him before. Colbert was an interesting character. I won't spend much time on him, but what appeals is that this was someone who came from way down in society. Okay, we think of France as being sort of ridden by priests and the aristocracy. Colbert was neither. Came from fairly humble beginnings. Got in with Mazarin, who was starting to run things for Louis XIV. And when Mazarin died, he knew where the money was. And he went to Louis XIV and said, "Can I interest you in large amounts of stuff that your previous financial sort of minister had squirreled away?" Louis XIV was overjoyed, promoted him to serious positions of authority, and Colbert did very, very well. He did a great job. But many people think of what Colbertism as an example of mercantilism. In many ways, he was just a super sophisticated, very modern thinker. He was after efficiency, and he was after the promotion of French industry. He was one of the people who got the lace industry going. He got the canals moving. He did his level best to broaden the base of the French economy. But he had a belief that industry is what matters. And so the physiocrats had a go at him because he was pushing down agriculture and promoting industry, pushing down the countryside, lifting the urban areas. And the physiocrats had the idea that the true wealth of a nation originates in the soil. Okay, what were his ideas? The biggie, he wanted to make the tax system efficient. He, in particular, had a problem with tax farming. And he tried to unify the tax structure into these, they called them the 5 grosses fermes, the 5 great farms. Central France was split into 5 areas. Each one had one person who was responsible for collecting all the taxes. Those 5 people got immensely rich, let it be said. But the amount of money now going through to the fiscus went up enormously. He wasn't able to get rid of the corruption, but he reduced it significantly. The corruption in French taxation remained a problem. It was one of the great causes of the French Revolution. Those of you who are chemists will know that Lavoisier was executed in the Revolution, not because he was a chemist. Lavoisier's problem was that he was a tax farmer, and they really resented the tax farmers. He opened up the French East India Company. He started French colonial expansion. The naval dockyards in Brittany were all founded under Colbert. He recognized the need for a powerful navy. State roads, state canals, the Canal du Midi, which is enormous, started all these new industries, silk, wool, glass. And he recognized that you needed to stimulate an economy. How do you stimulate an economy? Give people military contracts. The army is always a great way, and this is something that the United States has been doing for years. Military contracts are a fantastic way of stimulating an industry. But the person that most academics go to when they want the classic mercantilist, Thomas More. Spells his name differently to the author, incidentally. He was on the board of the East India Company. He wrote a series of instructions to his son. The instructions basically on how to look after the interests of the country and the interests of yourself and the East India Company when I'm dead. Basically, he wrote down his philosophy of business. And it's interesting because it's extremely readable. It's written like a businessman, basically bullet points, numbered. And above all, he sees both sides. He does his level best to present a balanced picture. So let's try and run through some of his notions, because he really is the classic. Okay? So he calls it England's treasure by foreign trade, or the balance of our foreign trade. And the basic rule, chapter 1 of his story, and the chapters are very short. We must always export more than we import. Run a trade surplus. Okay? And then chapter 2. And these are just sort of cut and paste. The ordinary means, therefore, to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value. Run a trade surplus. Then there's his catalogue of methods. He says, cultivate import substituting crops on waste land. We import, he says, all sorts of stuff. We import tobacco. Well, tobacco's a plant. Just find some piece of English soil that hasn't got tobacco on it and grow it. Was he anyone who understood the basics of agriculture? No. We need cotton. Find a piece of vacant ground and grow it. So what if it grows more efficiently elsewhere? We have waste land. And if it's waste, the opportunity cost is zero. Grow anything on it, and it's better than nothing. His second one, really a variant on this. Reduce imports of food, and above all, reduce imports of fabrics. Britain had been a fabric importer for years. And so his biggie was, if you don't absolutely have to import it, don't. And we'll see how this sort of caused problems in tomorrow's session. Then he said, all right, if the demand for your exports, he doesn't use the term price inelastic, but he thinks it. If people will buy your stuff even if you put the price up, what are you thinking about? Put the price up. But he says, if they would buy more than proportionally from you, if the price was a bit lower, then lower the price. Fair enough. Here's biggie, and this is where the Navigation Acts come in. Use your own ships for trade. Now, he wasn't just thinking in terms of the classic Navigation Act. Today we talk about visibles and invisibles in the trade balance, okay? The invisibles are things like insurance and shipping costs and so on and so forth. Britain has survived for years on the strength of its invisibles. Britain's visible exports went out the window years ago. But Britain's earnings in terms of banking, insurance, shipping, and so on and so forth were often really big money spinners, and still are. That's one of the reasons why Brexit is such a concern for so many people. Frugal use of natural wealth. He says basically, don't over-harvest, don't over-extract, don't over-mine. Be frugal, be abstemious, because your natural resources have to last you a long time. But if you're going to be a prodigal, if you're really going to be a heavy consumer, try to consume local manufacturers and thereby create jobs for local people. Okay? Don't be a prodigal consumer of imported products. He gave a specific example. He was very upset at the Dutch fishing in English waters. The Dutch are getting all their herring, he says, from our waters. And he's not the first person to say this. John Dee, 100 years earlier than this, had said that we have to keep the Spanish out of English waters. They're catching all our fish. Nothing changes. He felt that if we could get the Dutch out and catch the fish ourselves, we wouldn't have to import herring from Holland. The fish are here, other people are catching them. Catch them ourselves. Then he said, let's try to make England an entrepot centre. It's rather more sophisticated. If instead of just producing stuff for export and importing what you absolutely need, England can become a trading hub where you take off your 10% profit, become an exporter and importer for the entire region, then you basically end up making the profit that a merchant would make. If Britain can just become the place that everybody goes to buy stuff that other people, doesn't have to be English exports. If the Germans want stuff from Holland, they should come to London to get it. Okay, the idea that it can be the center of world trade and we can then cream off a small profit was really, quite unusual at that stage. But he says, absolutely do not, this is the mirror image, do not buy your imports from middlemen. If you're going to import stuff, don't buy retail, don't even buy wholesale, buy from the manufacturer. Okay, as a piece of advice to your son, that's not bad. The next caused a certain amount of problems. He says, consider exporting money. Now, that's interesting, because money is supposed to be what this whole business is about. Accumulating specie, accumulating gold and silver is supposed to be the object. Why then consider exporting gold and silver? Now, many of the mercantilists specifically preclude this. So Hornung, the great sort of Austrian mercantilist, in his 9 rules says absolutely forbid export of gold and silver. He says consider it quite seriously. Why? Well, he says ultimately you want to be able to get it back. If you export gold and silver in the form of loans, so that people can then use it to buy stuff from you again and get themselves indebted so that you can then buy their stuff really cheap, then you're onto something good. Okay? He was a shrewd thinker. Okay? If they can't buy from you because they haven't got the cash, lend them the cash. You can always get it back later. He talks about just encouraging exports. And then says, well, you can make your raw material imports duty-free. If you're going to be adding the value here, then import the raw materials rather than importing the manufactured product. And then, of course, make as much as possible domestically. So, heavily protectionist, obsessed with running exports, obsessed with running a trade surplus. But he wasn't naive. Now, tomorrow we'll look at what David Hume spotted as the immediate problem with running a consistent trade surplus. If you do it, you're just going to end up with more and more money inside the economy. And if you get more and more money building up inside an economy, sooner or later you're going to have inflation. Now, he spots that this is a potential weakness. And he says, as plenty or scarcity of money to make the price of the exchange high or low, so the overall underbalance of our trade doth effectively cause the plenty or scarcity of money. So, how do you correct this? How do you stop running a persistent trade surplus from boosting your money supply to such an extent that you end up with inflation? Well, the first thing is, if you're building up a war chest, you're effectively taking it out of circulation. You can tax it away and keep it in the treasury against the day when you really need it. But the other is, he said, if you're running bills of exchange, you're not carrying physical quantities of specie. The days of hauling vast amounts of gold and silver around so that pirates can steal it were already gone. The bill of exchange, the banker's acceptance, was already in place. So what you do is you tie it up in the form of bankers' acceptances, bills of exchange, and so on and so forth. And you can leave it floating around in Never Never Land overseas. It doesn't have to physically be on shore. It doesn't have to physically up your money supply. And he specifies, if the money supply does rise, well, princes should providently lay up treasure. Okay? If they don't, they're going to come to wanton misery. Okay, so he gives a recommendation, and there's a note of Machiavelli in this. He says, this is the necessary rule to be observed, that when more treasure must be raised than can be received by ordinary taxes, it ought to be done with equality to avoid the hate of the people. If you're going to be taxing, then tax evenly. Don't do it the way the French do. Okay, he spotted the risk. Okay, because people are never pleased except their contributions be granted by general consent. Okay, as a piece of advice to a son who's going into business and is going to be advising the king, it was probably pretty good. Okay, and that is 50 minutes. Punkt. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Yep.
You said just now that if you've got trade surpluses, you'll have inflation. But Japan, what happens there that Japan doesn't have?
The Japanese, for years, ran trade surpluses, and what they did was they bought up most of California. In exactly the same way as the Chinese today run consistent trade surpluses. You don't see inflation in China. What you see is that they're buying large chunks of Africa and huge chunks of the New York Stock Exchange. Ask yourself, why is it that in the middle of a recession, equity prices were sky high?
Is this a conscious decision, or is it just we've got spare cash, let's buy this?
What you want to do is to keep your exchange rate. These days, you want to keep your exchange rate down. Okay, you want to keep your currency weak so you can carry on exporting. The Chinese are classic mercantilists, and they don't want the yuan rising. So they did it the sensible way. And they sterilized their money supply by sending it offshore.
If they offshore it, what's the possible risk of the problem if the other neighbors or want to know that they're buying their properties and their development in their own country?
It is a problem. You know, it's a risk. People resent having their countries bought out from under them. But let's face it, the United States has been living very well for very many years on the strength of monies coming in from abroad. South Africa's been surviving on the strength of capital account inflows. You know, the way that the system works today is through exchange rate fluctuations. In these days, it worked on the strength of inflation and deflation. Money supply goes up, your currency inflates. Today, we try and keep the exchange rate doing the work instead of us carrying the pain.
Tony, are you saying that the mercantilist doctrine was the most rational thing to do in that time?
In its time, mercantilism made a lot of sense. In its time, at the beginning, you had monetary systems that were really weak. You had people who were surviving on barter. And when there's an insufficiency of cash, it becomes a brake on the economy. Money is the great lubricant. And if you're going to use coinage in order to get an economy moving, you have to get it from somewhere. So mercantilism, from that perspective, as a way of injecting the lubricant into the sort of cogs of the economy, made sense. And that was a big chunk of Keynes's support for it. It also made sense in the sense that this was the nation state emerging. And if you didn't have gold and silver, you really did stand a fair chance of getting hammered by your neighbors. You had to be able to pay mercenaries. And mercenaries don't work for paper. They want the real stuff. So that aspect made a certain amount of sense. But remember that this was an era when the New World was being discovered, when gold and silver were pouring out of South America and Central America into Spain. And we saw the effects of this. I mean, the Spanish economy imploded because of the inflation that was caused by South American gold and silver. And there was a school of economics in Spain, the School of Salamanca, that was very aware of the impacts of inflows of gold and silver on the Spanish economy, and were actively looking for ways of getting rid of it. And in fact, you ended up seeing Spanish gold and silver spreading through the whole of Europe. And there was this steady rise in prices as a result, from effectively the time of Columbus until the time of Elizabeth I in England. But the philosophy that trade should be seen as a zero-sum game, that's its great weakness.
That is what, sorry?
So the philosophy that trade should be seen as a zero-sum game, that if we're trading, I can only win if you lose. That's the great philosophical weakness of mercantilism lies right there. It should be possible for all parties to benefit. The question is, will they all benefit at the same time? And if somebody has a weak bargaining position in trade, would they be advised to protect in the short term so that they can trade more evenly in the long term? Should they try and broaden the base of their economy so they've got more things to trade in the future? Is short-term protection a good thing, as opposed to just protection, right or wrong? So there was some fairly sophisticated mercantilist thought. The thing is to find someone who is, Mann comes as close to being the complete mercantilist as you're going to find. But there were numerous others, and they did have interesting ideas. And they weren't all as naive as people think. The awareness of exchange rates and the issues surrounding import and export of gold and silver and the debasement of currencies and the effect of that on international trade was right at the heart of Elizabethan economic thinking. There was a very, very sophisticated set of economic thinkers around the court of Elizabeth I. They weren't just naive in the way that people use the term mercantilist typically as a term of disapprobation. He's nothing but a mercantilist. They weren't all fools.
You described China as being mercantilist, but mercantilism as being sort of outly even true, but they've done very well on it.
Oh, yeah.
And is then Trump got a point about China?
Well, ja, near. So Trump is arguing that America has lost jobs. He's right. America has lost a colossal number of jobs to China. The American industrial system has declined. The share of GDP that is made up by industry in the United States has dropped sharply in the last 3 decades. The question is, could they change that? Can he reverse the process? South Africa in 1994 lifted all sorts of regulations on imports. They really opened up to international trade, and they lost a lot of jobs. The South African clothing industry basically went down the tubes. Woodstock and Salt River used to employ thousands of people. Now, should they have lifted those regulations more slowly? I would argue yes. Should they have lifted them? Yeah, I mean, ultimately you need to open up. But do you need to do it in one big smash? Possibly not. But